Picture this. It is Christmas Eve, 1927, in the unforgiving high country of Montana. The temperature has dropped to 15 degrees below zero, the kind of cold that doesn't just freeze water, it freezes time. It freezes hope. Inside a drafty farmhouse that smells of stale grease and cheap whiskey, 14-year-old Ethan Cole stands trembling near the door. He isn't shaking from the cold, but from the rage in his father's eyes. A $20 bill has gone missing from his stepmother's purse. It's a lie, of course. She took it herself to buy gifts for her own son, but Ethan is the convenient scapegoat. He always has been. Brock, a man whose heart hardened long ago, sways on his feet, pointing a calloused finger at the door. "You aren't my blood," he slurs, the words cutting deeper than any knife. "Never were. You're your mother's mistake. Get out." Ethan doesn't argue. He learned years ago that arguing with Brock is like screaming at a wall. He grabs the only thing that truly belongs to him, a small, rusted tin box that had belonged to his late mother, Sarah. It contains a letter and a hand-drawn map, his only compass in a world that has just thrown him away. The door slams shut, and the silence of the blizzard swallows him whole. Ethan steps off the porch and into a white void. He has no heavy coat, no boots, no food, just a thin shirt and a heart pounding against his ribs. He's 14, alone, walking into a Montana whiteout. He knows one thing. If he stops moving, he dies. The wind howls like a wounded animal, cutting through his clothes as if they weren't even there. 1 mile, 2 miles. The cold sinks into his bones, turning his fingers and toes into numb, useless weights. His mind begins to drift, the hypothermia whispering that it would be so easy to just lie down and sleep. But he clutches that tin box against his chest. "Find Silas," his mother's letter had promised. "He will protect you." After 3 agonizing hours, his legs finally give out. He stumbles into a clearing, his vision blurring. But there, through the swirling snow, he sees it. A faint, yellow glow. A small cabin with smoke rising from the chimney. He collapses 50 feet from the porch. The darkness begins to take him, but just before he fades, he hears something. The heavy crunch of boots on snow. A door flying open, and a rough, deep voice shouting over the wind. "Hold on, son, I've got you!" Ethan woke up to the crackle of a fire and the smell of pine. He wasn't in the snow anymore. He was buried under 3 heavy quilts in a room that felt safer than anywhere he had ever been. Sitting in a rocking chair by the hearth was an old man with hands like granite and eyes that held the same storm gray color as Ethan's own. "You made it," Silas Thorne said, his voice rough with emotion. "I've been waiting for you, son." That night marked the beginning of the 19 best years of Ethan's life. Silas didn't just give Ethan a home, he gave him a legacy. The Ashfords had been stonemasons for generations, and Silas taught Ethan that stone was more than just heavy rock. It was alive. "Stone is a battery," Silas would say, pressing his palm against the cool basement walls of their farmhouse. "It drinks the heat all day and whispers it back to you all night. You treat the earth right, and she'll keep you warm when the devil himself is freezing." Ethan absorbed everything: the geometry of the arch, the patience of the chisel, and the science of thermal mass. He grew from a frightened boy into a strong, quiet man. He met Lily, a schoolteacher with a laugh that could lighten even the darkest Montana winters, and they built a simple, good life on Silas's farm. But time, unlike stone, does not hold. In the spring of 1946, Silas took to his bed for the last time. He gripped Ethan's hand, his strength fading but his eyes intense. "There's one thing left undone," Silas rasped. "The north parcel, the old foundation your great-grandfather laid in 1848. I never had the money to finish it. You do it, Ethan. Build something that proves the old ways still matter." 3 days later, Silas was gone. The grief was still fresh when Ethan sat in the town lawyer's office for the reading of the will. The farm, the tools, and the mysterious north parcel were left to him. But the moment the lawyer finished speaking, the heavy oak door swung open. Harlan Vance strode in. He was the wealthiest developer in the county, a man in a tailored suit who saw land only as profit margins. He slammed a sheaf of papers onto the desk. "That will is invalid," Vance announced, a shark-like grin spreading across his face. "Decades ago, your drunk of a father, Brock, signed that north parcel over as collateral for a gambling debt. He never paid up. That land belongs to me." Ethan stood up, his blood running cold. Even from the grave, his father was trying to take everything from him. "Get out of my way, kid," Vance sneered, pointing a manicured finger at Ethan's chest. "I'm bulldozing that old pit next week." Ethan looked at the papers, then at the man trying to erase his grandfather's dream. The scared boy who had walked through a blizzard was gone. In his place stood a stonemason who knew how to weather a storm. "We'll see about that," Ethan said quietly. "I have a promise to keep." The judge ruled in Ethan's favor, declaring that Brock had no legal right to pledge the land as collateral. Ethan kept the property, but the legal fees drained every cent of the Ashford savings. He stood on the edge of the overgrown foundation in the spring of 1947, land rich and cash poor, staring at a hole in the ground that needed a roof. Lumber was expensive, ingenuity was free. Ethan found his answer in a post-war surplus catalog, a decommissioned military Quonset hut. It was a semicircular shell of corrugated steel, designed for barracks and storage, not for a family home. But where others saw ugly scrap metal, Ethan saw a shape that would shed snow and deflect the wind like a shield. When the curved steel ribs began to rise from the ancient stone foundation, the laughing started. It began as whispers in the general store and grew into open mockery at the local barber shop. They called it the Iron Igloo. They called it Renfield's Folly. Miller, Ethan's nearest neighbor, a man who prided himself on doing things the normal way, stopped his truck by the fence one afternoon. He leaned out the window, chewing on a toothpick. "You building a house or a giant soup can, son?" Miller shouted, chuckling. "Steel doesn't hold heat, Ethan. You're going to wake up a popsicle by January." Ethan didn't stop welding. "Stone holds heat, Mr. Miller. The steel just keeps the snow off." Miller shook his head and drove off, laughing all the way to town. A week later, Harlan Vance pulled up in a sleek black sedan that looked out of place on the dirt road. He didn't shout. He just stood by the fence, shaking his head with feigned pity. "It's an eyesore, Ethan," Vance said, lighting a cigar. "I'll give you $200 for the lot. Just walk away before you embarrass yourself further. You're a mason, not an architect. You don't know what you're doing." "I'm not selling," Ethan replied, his voice flat and hard. "And I'm not failing." The town of Iron Creek turned Ethan's struggle into a spectator sport. A betting pool started at the local tavern. The odds were 10-1 that the roof would collapse with the first heavy snow, and 5-1 that Ethan would come crawling to Vance for a loan before Christmas. Ethan worked alone, fueled by coffee and stubbornness. He spent the autumn months insulating the steel shell with anything he could scavenge: old newspapers, wool blankets, and fiberglass batting. He lined the interior until the walls were 6 inches thick. He installed a modest wood stove in the basement, trusting in Silas's old lessons: heat the stone and the stone heats you. By November, the strange hybrid house was finished. It looked like a metallic blister rising from the earth, half bunker, half barn. It was ugly. It was weird. But as the first gray clouds of winter began to gather over the mountains, Ethan pulled his wife Lily close and looked at their creation. "Let them laugh," he whispered. "We'll see who's laughing when the wind blows." The signs were there for anyone who knew how to read them. The cattle huddled against the fence lines, and the air carried a metallic scent of ozone and ice. On January 12, 1948, the sky over Iron Creek turned a bruised shade of purple, and the great blizzard descended like a gavel. It wasn't just snow. It was a white hurricane. Temperatures plummeted to 30 degrees below zero within hours. Winds gusted at 60 miles per hour, driving ice crystals horizontal until they scoured paint from wood. Down in the valley, the sensible houses were losing the war. At the Miller farm, the wind found gaps around the window frames that Miller had never noticed before. He fed his wood stove until the iron glowed cherry red, but the heat vanished the moment it left the firebox. By the second night, the pipes burst, spraying water that froze into slick sheets of ice on the kitchen floor. The temperature inside the farmhouse dropped to 40 degrees. His 5-year-old granddaughter, Sophie, huddled under a mountain of quilts, her shivering violent and uncontrollable. Up on the hill, inside the iron igloo, the thermometer on the wall read a steady 66 degrees. The massive stone foundation, which had been absorbing the Earth's 50-degree heat all year, now released it slowly, like a giant, gentle radiator. The steel shell, insulated with Ethan's scavenged scraps, trapped the warmth tight. The wind screamed harmlessly over the curved roof, finding no purchase to tear it away. Ethan sat in his rocking chair, listening to the gale. He added a single log to the stove, not out of desperation, but for the comfort of the flame. On the third night, the storm reached its howling crescendo. Ethan was dozing when a frantic, heavy pounding on the door jolted him awake. It wasn't the wind. It was a human hand. He threw the bolts and shoved the heavy door open against the drift. Standing there in the swirling white void was Miller. The man who had laughed the loudest was now unrecognizable. His eyebrows were frosted with ice, his face a mask of terror. In his arms, he clutched a small, limp bundle wrapped in blankets. "Ethan!" Miller screamed over the roar of the gale, his voice cracking. "Please! The furnace died. Sophie! She won't wake up." Ethan looked past him. Through the blinding snow, he saw the faint yellow beams of another vehicle crawling up his driveway. Harlan Vance's luxury sedan, struggling through the drifts like a wounded beetle. The town that had mocked the fool on the hill was now climbing it, begging for the warmth only he possessed. Ethan didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for an apology. He didn't say, "I told you so." "Get her inside," Ethan shouted, grabbing Miller's frozen shoulder to pull him across the threshold. "Get them all inside." The heavy steel door slammed shut, cutting off the scream of the wind. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the wood stove and the shallow, ragged breathing of the people huddled on the floor. By midnight, 17 people were sheltering inside Ethan's iron igloo. They were families who had lost their heat, neighbors who had lost their way, and men who had lost their pride. In the corner, little Sophie stirred. The color was returning to her cheeks, the deadly blue tint fading into a healthy flush. She blinked open her eyes, looked up at her grandfather, and whispered, "Pop-Pop, it's warm." That single word broke Miller. The man who had spent months leading the chorus of mockery against Ethan collapsed into a chair, his face buried in his rough hands. His shoulders shook with silent sobs. He had bet money that this house would be a tomb. Instead, it was the only lifeboat in a white ocean. Ethan walked over, not with judgment, but with a mug of hot coffee. He placed a hand on his neighbor's shaking shoulder. "Drink this, John," Ethan said softly. "It'll help." Miller looked up, his eyes red and swollen. "I called you a fool, Ethan. I told everyone you were crazy, and you opened the door." "My grandfather used to say that the stone doesn't hold grudges," Ethan replied, looking around at the room full of people. "It just holds heat. I figure we should do the same." Even Harlan Vance, stripped of his expensive coat and his arrogance, sat quietly by the stove, thumbing through Silas's old journal. He ran his fingers over the diagrams of the thermal mass foundation, reading the notes written by a man he had dismissed as a pauper. "He knew," Vance murmured almost to himself. "He knew this whole time." When the storm finally broke 3 days later, the world outside was buried under 4 feet of snow. But inside the house on the hill, the community of Iron Creek had survived. They didn't leave as just neighbors, they left as believers. Ethan Cole didn't just build a house that winter, he built a legacy. In the years that followed, the Renfield house became a local legend. It wasn't famous because of its strange steel roof or its thick stone walls. It was famous because, on the coldest night in history, it was the place where forgiveness proved to be even warmer than the fire. Now, I have a question for you. If you were Ethan, if the people who had mocked your dreams and bet on your failure came knocking at your door in the middle of the night, would you have let them in? Or would you have left the door locked? It's a hard question to answer honestly. We all like to think we'd be the hero, but pride is a cold thing, and resentment is heavy. Ethan Cole chose to drop that weight, and because he did, 17 people lived to see another sunrise. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can build isn't a wall to keep people out, but a roof to keep them safe. If this story warmed your heart, please do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We tell stories here about the underdogs, the dreamers, and the quiet heroes who change the world one stone at a time. And drop a comment below. I would open the door. Let's see how many of us are ready to be like Ethan. Until next time, stay warm.